9 in the morning. The clocks in every time zone across the nation clicked in unison. 300 million people stepped out their front doors, moved toward the stores, and reached for their cards. It was not a protest. It was not a riot. It was a precise, synchronized pulse. In that single moment, $4 trillion of dormant credit woke up. The air felt static, charged with the weight of invisible promises. Every swipe, every tap, every digital handshake triggered a cascade of data moving through the fiber optic veins of the country. Merchants stood behind counters, waiting for the first wave to hit. They did not know that the collective limit of every household in the nation was being pushed to its breaking point at the exact same second. The system had been built on the bet that no one would ever do this. The bet was wrong. $1 trillion moved in the first minute, then another. The sheer volume of the surge began to hum through the network. A soundless vibration felt only in the cooling fans of server farms and the frantic blinking of transaction lights. The nation was buying its own future, and the bill was already coming due. Shelves stripped bare in minutes. High-end electronics, luxury watches, and travel packages vanished from inventory logs faster than the system could refresh. It was a harvest of everything not bolted down. The pace of commerce defied all previous benchmarks. Within the first hour, the national GDP numbers climbed at a vertical, impossible angle. On paper, the country was drowning in wealth. The screens in retail offices glowed green with record-breaking transaction volumes. It looked like a miracle of pure prosperity. People walked out of stores carrying bags filled with their new acquisitions, their faces lit by the glow of instant ownership. But the numbers were lying. The wealth was a ghost, built entirely on borrowed time and plastic. Beneath the surface of these successful transactions, the digital pipes began to groan. Data packets started to jitter. The massive influx of requests created a bottleneck that no algorithm had ever been tested against. The servers in the back rooms of the banking hubs ran hot, the cooling fans spinning into a high-pitched whine. The illusion of infinite money was holding, but only just. A microscopic lag crept into every authorization request, a tiny stutter in the pulse of the economy that signaled the end of the honeymoon phase. By hour 3, the digital architecture hit the wall. The transaction networks, designed to handle steady, predictable retail traffic, could not process the simultaneous demand of millions. At the point of sale, the machines stopped buzzing. The screens lingered on a spinning icon. Timeouts became the new reality. A customer in a checkout line tapped their card again, then again, but the terminal remained frozen. The invisible promise that had fueled the morning, the assumption that a card swipe equals immediate value, began to fray in real time. People checked their phones. They looked at the clerks. The initial rush of acquisition curdled into a collective, bewildered silence. In data centers across the country, the lights on the server racks turned from a steady, pulsing green to a frantic, blinking red. Requests piled up in queues that had no exit. The system was no longer processing. It was buffering. Every swipe became a gamble, and every gamble started to return a connection error. The illusion of infinite credit was not just slowing down. It was beginning to tear apart at the seams, leaving millions of people stranded with their carts, their cards, and their sudden, sharp realization that the network was no longer listening. By hour 6, the fraud algorithms stopped waiting for instructions. They looked at the unprecedented, erratic transaction volume and reached the only logical conclusion: a catastrophic, coordinated cyber attack. In a synchronized heartbeat, every major bank's security system triggered a kill switch. Millions of cards were instantly invalidated, turned into useless plastic rectangles. The screens at checkout counters flickered once and settled into a dead, dark state. Then, the auditory chaos began. Across the nation, call centers were buried by a tidal wave of automated hold music. Thousands of agents sat at their desks, headsets on, staring at screens showing nothing but endless, blinking error queues. The system could no longer distinguish a legitimate customer from a threat, so it chose to silence them all. People paced in parking lots, pressing redial, only to be met with recorded loops promising that their call was important. The machines were no longer serving the public. They were actively defending themselves against it. The digital infrastructure had transitioned from a malfunctioning utility to a locked vault. Every attempt to resolve the issue only added to the mounting backlog of requests, driving the banks closer to total institutional paralysis. The silence of the machines was replaced by the frantic, echoing noise of a system that had completely lost its grip on reality. By hour 12, the panic in the server rooms reached the boardrooms. The banks finally confronted the brutal math of their existence. They had operated for decades on a single, silent assumption that the average citizen would only ever use a small fraction of their available credit. They had oversold their limits just as airlines oversell seats, banking on the statistical certainty that most passengers never show up. Today, the passengers had arrived in force, and they were all demanding their place in the cabin. The bet that users would remain dormant died in the cold light of the morning. Executives stared at the ledgers, watching the numbers swell into an impossible mountain of debt. The invisible infrastructure was not just broken, it was fundamentally bankrupt. Every dollar of credit that had been promised was now a liability they could not cover. The financial giants, usually masters of risk, found themselves paralyzed by the weight of their own over-leveraged promises. They had built an empire on the belief that the system would never be tested, and now that it was, the foundation had simply evaporated. The reality was clear. They had promised the world more money than they actually possessed, and the clock was ticking toward a total collapse of their balance sheets. By hour 24, the boardrooms were no longer debating policy. They were fighting for survival. Banks began a desperate, uncoordinated fire sale of their liquid assets. They dumped stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings at a fraction of their value, trying to scrape together enough cash to cover the mounting tide of merchant obligations. The markets reacted to the sudden flood of assets with violent volatility. Prices cratered as every firm tried to sell at the same time. Despite the frantic selling, the pile of cash remained woefully insufficient. The debt was too large, and the liquidity was already gone. When the last bond was sold and the vaults remained empty, the executives understood the finality of their position. There was only one entity left with the power to print a way out. In a room thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of cooling fans, a senior director picked up the receiver. His hands were steady, but his voice was tight. He dialed the direct, encrypted line to the Federal Reserve. It was a one-way path to the emergency window. If the Fed did not answer, the entire system would cease to exist by morning. He held the phone to his ear, listening to the silence of the line, waiting for the ring to break. The connection clicked open. Within seconds, the mandate was issued. The Federal Reserve opened the emergency window, and the digital gates swung wide. Trillions in liquidity flooded the system, a tidal wave of capital designed to plug the holes in the banking sector. The panic, which had been tearing through the financial markets like a wildfire, hit the wall of newly minted money and stopped dead. The banks were saved, their ledgers stabilized, their obligations were met, and the threat of a complete collapse evaporated as quickly as it had arrived. But the salvation was one-sided. While the institutions were patched and reinforced, the 300 million people who had triggered the surge remained exposed. The rescue was not for the citizens, it was for the architecture of the lenders. The population found themselves locked into a new, harsh reality. Every swipe, every impulsive purchase, and every activated credit line was now a permanent, frozen debt. The banks had regained their footing, but they had left the consumers behind, stranded on the other side of a widening chasm. The system remained intact, but the individual was now shackled to a 22% interest rate that would define their future for decades to come. The relief at the top floor of the banks did not reach the streets. For the average person, the morning after brought a different kind of silence. Every account now displayed a balance that refused to shrink. At 22% interest, the math became a predator. Every single day, over $1 billion in interest charges bled out of the pockets of the population, evaporating into the void of the banking ledger. Paychecks arrived, but they were no longer money. They were merely minimum payments. A worker would deposit a check, watch it disappear in seconds, and see the remaining balance drop by a fraction of a percent. The cycle tightened. Families canceled subscriptions, stopped dining out, and cut every non-essential purchase to the bone. The gears of commerce began to seize. Retailers sat in empty stores, watching the inventory gather dust. The momentum that had defined the nation's growth for decades vanished, replaced by a stagnant, heavy stillness. Consumption stopped because the capacity to spend had been legally harvested. People were working simply to pay for the privilege of having been allowed to spend 2 days earlier. The economy had not just slowed, it had been drained, leaving behind a hollowed-out landscape where every dollar earned was already claimed by the debt. This catastrophe was not a glitch in the machine. It was the machine operating exactly as intended. Your credit limit is not a gift or a service. It is a product engineered to lock you into a cycle of 22% interest payments, ensuring a perpetual flow of wealth from your wallet to the lender. The system relies on a statistical bet that you will keep your utilization low and your debt dormant. When that bet fails, the safety net deploys, but you are not inside it. The banks hold the emergency window at the Federal Reserve, a direct line to infinite liquidity. You hold only your balance. This is the core mechanic of your personal finances. You are the collateral in a game where the house has a guaranteed exit strategy and you do not. The only way to move against this design is to pay your balance in full, stripping the bank of its interest revenue while consuming their rewards. One person doing this is a minor inconvenience to their model. 300 million people doing it simultaneously would dismantle the entire architecture of the economy. For now, the machine stays upright, fed by the guarantee of the central bank. You remain on the outside, looking at a balance that you can never fully erase. The machine survives only because the Fed picks up the phone. It is a fragile, invisible tether, keeping the entire structure from folding under its own weight. But every system carries the seed of its own obsolescence. Consider the inevitable limit of this reliance. What happens when the Fed can no longer pick up the phone? When the liquidity window is bolted shut and the emergency signals fail to reach the other side? The guarantee that props up $36 trillion of national debt relies on the assumption of infinite confidence. If that faith evaporates, the numbers on the screen cease to represent value and become merely static. Imagine the sudden silence of a world where the debt simply ceases to exist, not through payment, but through total systemic erasure. The assets, the accounts, the promises, all gone in a single digital heartbeat. This is the edge of the map. We have walked the path of the individual consumer, but the next question is far larger. What remains when the ledger itself is wiped clean? The answer is not in the books. It is waiting in the dark, and it is closer than you think. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to like and subscribe for more.